Hey everyone, today we're going to be discussing the founding documents, which will focus primarily on key concept 3.2. So go ahead and take a second, pause the video if you'd like, and go ahead and read the key concept and then obviously the sub-concepts as well. Okay, so feel free to do that right now, but we're going to move on. So here's kind of the graphic organizer that is going to drive our discussion today. But pretty much the main idea, is that new ideas are going to be challenging old ways. Okay, so we're going to start by looking at how new ideas led to debates on religion and politics. We're then going to look at how one of the very new ideas at the time was kind of a fear of centralized power, because people were kind of sick and tired of having these autocratic regimes where the power lied with just one man or one woman. And people kind of are sick and tired of that, so we're going to see kind of a decentralization of power, and in many governments, a splitting up of power. And then we're also going to see how these new ideas spread to other parts of the world. So that'll be our focus for today. And so the first thing I want us to look at is there are these new ideas that pretty much lead to debates on religion and politics. Okay, so one of the new ideas that we see, especially in religion in America, is that many Americans were starting to believe that they were almost like the chosen people, that they were special. Kind of this idea of American exceptionalism, that in many respects, that America was almost the shining light in a dark, dark world. And to a certain extent, I think we can kind of see where that's coming from, because many American colonists felt like they were trying to do something that had not been tried before, which was to, establish a government that was set up with, these new ideas that respected God-given rights. Okay, so these new ideas in religion, these new ideas in politics, were very much intertwined. Okay, many of these Enlightenment ideas, like John Locke of his natural rights or Montesquieu's separation of powers, all these new ideas are spreading across the Atlantic Ocean into the Americas, and it's creating debates about how should we move forward, and when we do move forward, what should we kind of set up? And so all these new ideas, like I said, are kind of challenging the established way that people used to do business with. Okay, so all these new ideas in America really kind of culminate in the Declaration of Independence, which was very much influenced by Thomas Paine's common sense. And we've talked about this a lot already, and if you want some more instruction on the Declaration of Independence, see one of my other videos where I go over the DOI, and I also go over common sense as well. But pretty much we're seeing these new ideas kind of flower into all these different democratic principles. Okay, we see many state constitutions that are pretty much founding themselves on many of these democratic principles. Like, for instance, in Pennsylvania, their constitution very much recognized the new ideas of the time. There was a unicameral legislature where the common man got the representation. There was no quote-unquote executive to veto anything. It was pretty much just the voice of the people. All white men could vote, and while that doesn't seem very nice today, back then that was incredibly progressive to say that all white men could vote, even white men who didn't own property. And so we're seeing in America these new ideas are kind of flowering, and we're seeing kind of this explosion of democratic principles being put forth in America. And while obviously there are some things that today we look back at and say, well, that doesn't sound really cool, like not allowing women or African Americans or Native Americans the right to vote. At the time, it was quite progressive, and it kind of started the march towards where we are today. We also see this whole principle of a weak central government resulting in the Articles of Confederation. The Americans, are very scared of having a repeat where they have this tyrannical king or this tyrannical parliament that is running over them. So they basically, our first constitution, the Articles of Confederation, is set up to be very weak as a result of that. So let's kind of pay more attention to the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation was set up to be a pretty weak constitution, and I think it was set up to be weak on purpose because people thought a strong central government was a threat to their liberty. But what we see happening is that perhaps the Articles of Confederation was a little too weak. For instance, it was nearly impossible to change the Articles of Confederation. So if a problem popped up where the original founders of the Articles of Confederation didn't foresee. It was very difficult to change that, because to actually change the Articles, you needed unanimous support to amend it. In addition to that, to just pass a law required 9 of 13 states. And that's not just a majority, that's a supermajority. So you had to really have consensus to pass a law. And so it made it very difficult for this body to really act and address certain issues, which resulted, I think, in a lot of people that were very upset. Which you look at Shays' Rebellion, you see farmers rebelling in Massachusetts because they feel like the issues that they're dealing with can't be addressed. Also, we have no power to tax under the Articles of Confederation, so the federal government is essentially quite poor. And with no money comes, with no money means they pretty much have no power. Under the Articles, we also see that the Congress couldn't enforce any interstate commerce. They couldn't make treaties with other countries. And so a lot of Europeans looked at our government and said, what's the point of this thing even? You guys can't even make a decision. We can't make any agreements with you. You guys can't even keep your own, house in order. And so we see a lot of chaos ensuing, pretty much because the Articles of Confederation government is really too weak to deal with anything. And so as a result, it becomes quite clear to many that a change has to be made. And so that's where we see the Constitutional Convention being called to order. And we see almost all the states, I say almost all the states because Rhode Island didn't go because, they thought that they weren't going to like the outcome. But for the most part, we see a good representation here of the 13 states. Okay. Now, when the convention starts, James Madison is kind of one of the leaders of the convention. He proposes the Virginia Plan, which is essentially going to just say, let's get rid of the Articles of Confederation because it doesn't work, which pretty much goes against, what the whole point of this convention was for, because most states had sent delegates there just to essentially amend the Articles, not to completely throw it out. But regardless of that, the Virginia Plan by Madison proposes a bicameral legislature. And his proposal is that representation is based entirely on a state's population. So populous states will get most of the say. And while that might sound fair, the small states are clearly going to be very unhappy with this, because in the old system, under the Articles of Confederation, each state was equal. Each state got one vote. And so it didn't matter how many people were in that state, they had equal representation regardless of that. Okay? I'll also have you note, because some people always ask, what's the point of having a bicameral legislature? And the point of that, you see in Madison's plan here, is that the lower house is elected directly by the people, whereas the upper house is elected by state legislatures. So in a certain sense, the common man is being allowed to have some sort of representation, but many of the elite back then were very fearful of letting the common man have too much say in who represented them in government. So they wanted to have some separation there. That is why state legislatures picked the Senate in this case. So let's get back to the small states here. The small states are going to hate this plan. So they're going to propose the New Jersey plan. And they're essentially going to suggest that we just fix the Articles of Confederation, make it a stronger government, and kind of, like I said, just fix the problems. In essence, do what they came there to do. They don't obviously want proportional representation, because that would weaken their voice and that would weaken their power. So clearly, we have two sides where we're having an issue here. It's completely opposite here. So obviously, we need a compromise, and thankfully, this is the compromise. The compromise is the Connecticut Compromise, also known as the Great Compromise, where we see the Constitution basically creating a federal government where there are 3 branches. So they're very much drawing upon Montesquieu here, who believed in the separation of powers. So instead of all the power of government being under just one person or one group of people, it's split into 3 branches that can essentially check the other. Okay? But the big compromise here is the upper house and the lower house in the legislative branch. The upper house, we see equal representation regardless of population, so each state gets 2 reps no matter what. But then the lower house is based on population. And so there's the compromise. The big states get what they want in the lower house, the small states get what they want in the Senate, and all parties can therefore agree to this compromise. Okay? The other compromise that has to be made, though, is what do we do with slaves when it comes to counting them as representation? Okay? For representation purposes, I should say. The southern states obviously want slaves to count as citizens because that would mean they would get more representation in the House of Representatives, whereas the North obviously doesn't want to see that happen because, from the North's perspective, they're not citizens because obviously they're enslaved. And so there's a compromise on slaves and how they're represented, and that, of course, is the infamous 3/5 compromise, where each slave would count as 3/5 of a person. So once again, the North and South are seen here compromising on slavery. The North also gets the South to commit to ending the slave trade by 1808, which is important because many people saw the slave trade as being an abomination and being against the ideals of the Republic. And the Southerners were willing to do this as well because for the most part at this point, the American slave population was reproducing fast enough that they could meet the growing demands of many of the Southern plantations. Okay? So anyways, once the Constitution is agreed upon at the convention, it doesn't just mean it goes into law. The states have to agree to it. And if the states didn't agree to it, they would have not ratified it, and it would just kind of just gone into history as pretty much nothing. Okay? So we see this debate that takes place in America where you have a group of people known as the Federalists who basically support the Constitution. They want a strong central government that has a lot of power over the states, that can create this organized nation that can flourish. And then you have the anti-Federalists who very much fear a strong central government, and they want the power of government to stay with the states because they feel the states are the best way to protect people's liberties. So we've had two groups that have this fundamental disagreement about essentially where should the power lie. The Federalists think it should be with a strong central government. The Anti-Federalists, they feel it should stay with the states. They also have very different views of America. For instance, the Anti-Federalists, they value the agricultural society. They're very much fearful of the moneyed interests kind of running amok and taking over too much power. And they also want guarantees in the form of a Bill of Rights that lays out the protections that citizens have against their government. The Federalists are a little bit more snooty. They don't trust the common man. They feel like if you let the common man have too much power, that they're too easily corrupted and they're too easily swayed one way or the other. And they essentially fear that it would create an unstable government. So the Federalists want a large republic that can keep control of the factions and that it will essentially be governed by the elite. That's kind of their vision of America. They also obviously want, more of a European model of a nation where there's industry and urbanization and commerce and trade. So like I said, two very different views of America here getting set up. Okay? But eventually, we all know this, the Constitution does get ratified, and a big part of that is the Federalists eventually do agree to a Bill of Rights that if the Anti-Federalists jump on board, the Bill of Rights will be a priority, and it was. The Bill of Rights does happen relatively quickly, and the Anti-Federalists kind of get what they really wanted, which is security of their rights, listed in paper, obviously, pen and paper. So anyways, what we do see happening is, once the Constitution does go into place, though, there's almost instantaneous debate on what does the Constitution say. And we see a kind of opposing sides getting set up here, kind of debating, having these constitutional debates on, essentially what is the role of the federal government, what should the federal government be able to do, and what shouldn't it be able to do. And it pretty much revolves around Alexander Hamilton, who was the leader of the Federalists, and Thomas Jefferson, who will become the leader of the Democratic Republicans, which then become the Democrats. Hamilton's financial plan is very controversial for several reasons. Number one, he has this plan that he feels will basically create a stable American economy that will give us some street credit on the world stage. Okay? And what I mean by that is other countries need to lend us money. They need to be able to trust us. And so he wants to put a plan in place that will make that happen. And so the first step that he's going to do is he wants to redeem all Articles of Confederation securities and currency. Okay, all this money and all these bonds that were given out during the Revolutionary War, which have since depreciated, meaning that if a bond was worth $100 at one point, now it's worth only 10. So it's depreciated. Hamilton wants the world to see that the United States is very set on making sure that when they say something is worth something, that it is. And so the federal government is going to reimburse all the people that hold those bonds and securities at face value. Now, that doesn't sound very controversial, but when you consider that many of our soldiers who fought in the war were paid with Confederation bonds, and then they became so worthless that many of the soldiers then sold those bonds to get whatever they could for them, they're going to be pretty irritated because all these speculators who bought all these depreciated securities are now set to make a huge profit, meaning they might have spent $10 to buy a $100 bond, and now they're going to make a $90 profit. Now imagine if that's even bigger money. Okay, so a lot of people are going to be pretty insulted by that, and they're going to be pretty angry with that. They're going to feel cheated because of that. So that's going to make a lot of people kind of hate this plan. The other thing that's going to really kind of irritate Jefferson's Democratic Republicans is that Hamilton's going to propose to create a national bank. Because now that we have a national debt as a result of paying back all this debt and assuming all this state debt from the war, the federal government's going to have a national debt. And so a national bank is needed to then control that national debt. And Hamilton's going to look at the Constitution and say, look, there's a part of the Constitution that says we can do anything that's necessary and proper to essentially run the government. So he's taking a very loose interpretation of the Constitution. He's, kind of saying, oh, it says this, so therefore we can do this. And Jefferson's people are going to be like, no. It doesn't say we can make a bank. And because it doesn't say we can't make a bank, we can't do that. So he's taking a very kind of strict interpretation of the Constitution. Okay, so once again, we're seeing all of these constitutional debates are kind of driving a wedge between the American people, specifically Hamilton's people and Jefferson's people. Okay, Hamilton's also going to try to raise revenue to pay for this national debt, and the way he does this is he puts a tax on whiskey. Okay, which is really going to hurt many American farmers in Pennsylvania and on the frontier that take corn and grains and make it into whiskey and sell that whiskey to the Europeans or even some of the cities on the eastern seaboard for goods. So they're going to be very hurt by that. On the same hand, the tariffs that are slapped on manufactured goods are going to serve once again the bankers and the merchants in New England. And so a lot of Americans are going to kind of smell a rat there. Okay, so once again, we're seeing these issues kind of, like I said, divide Americans here. Okay, we also see Americans being further split by the French Revolution. So the French Revolution is taking place, right? And we have the Democratic Republicans, and they're siding with the French, and we have the Federalists who are siding with the British. And so it's kind of asking the Americans to kind of pick sides. And so it's creating more and more conflict. And I don't want to get too much more into this because we're going to talk more about this in a different lecture. So I'm just going to move on. Okay? But we also see, one of the effects of the American Revolution, one of the cool effects of the American Revolution is the spreading of liberty. That in many ways, we inspire other people. Our revolution inspired the French to rebel against their king. And obviously that went a little crazy and it didn't maybe work out like people originally thought it would. But it did inspire people to kind of push for democracy and to push for their God-given rights, which is kind of a cool thing. We also see the Haitians looking to us for inspiration, so that's cool. So we do see liberty being spread. All these new ideas are being spread around the globe. Democracy is spreading. God-given freedoms are spreading, and that's all obviously a positive development. Okay? So I'm going to stop there for today, guys. I hope this helped. Have a